cultivate opportunities, use our influential voice, make room and give space, and walk the talk. I really believe that the dialogue, reflection, and learning that happens in these sessions helps us all to do these things that are so critical to creating the workplaces we need now and in the future. This series is focused on what we can do as individuals, what our own leadership can be, and what change we can drive inside our workplaces. So I thank you for being here and invite you to dive in with us and with each other this morning. Next, it's my honor to thank all of our sponsors who make this work possible. These organizations are choosing to commit to this work in partnership, truly investing, doing the important work of equity inside their own workplaces and providing opportunities for all of our region to learn and grow. Thank you first off to our series presenting sponsor, Bremer Bank, which has been our strong partner in this series for 3 years now. They truly embody their commitment to equity in this partnership and in the work they do internally and throughout our community. And to this group, where I say quite a sincere thank you. I see Colette's in the house this morning, so welcome, Colette. Thank you to our partner across our strategic priority to grow leaders, Wells Fargo. And thank you to our corporate sponsors, Allianz Life, Anderson Corporation, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, CHS, Flint Hills Resources, Land O'Lakes, M Health Fairview, Mille Lacs Corporate Ventures, Redpath and Company, Sunrise Banks, Travelers Foundation, Venture Solutions, and Xcel Energy. Thank you also to our contributing sponsor, Highway Credit Union. I also want to thank our content partner, Sankofa Leadership Network, and Anika Ward, our series facilitator. And finally, our host sponsor, the Science Museum of Minnesota. We are virtual, but the Science Museum remains committed to this work, and we're grateful for their partnership. To all of our sponsors, I say thank you. We could not do this work without you. Now, usually at this point, I would turn this over to Victoria Ford, whom many of you have gotten to know. And Victoria has moved on from our organization to pursue a dream of her own, opening a bookstore. We will miss her voice here, candidly, but we are so happy to have her continue to consult with us as needed, and we really wish her well. So overseeing this programming, Victoria's absence, is our own Megan Forgrave, who is our Vice President of Programming and Member Experience. So welcome, Megan, and thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bea, and good morning, everyone. Well, I will tell you, I had a planning call last week with Victoria and Anika, and just after listening to Anika talk, I'm very excited for this workshop today. For those of you who attended last month, you'll remember that we heard some history about our community and why this work is so important, and that was really helpful. Today, Anika is going to guide us to reflect and really dive into our own roles and our stances and the narratives that are at play within our worlds. We will have 2 moments of conversation in groups today. And so I really encourage you, stick around, while we're doing those, lean into those and share with each other. Even think about jotting down each other's names if you think you're connecting with somebody who you might want to reach back out to later to continue the conversation. Because this is really meant to be both a learning experience, but also it's a place to build relationships. So I invite you to do that today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for this series and our main speaker today, Anika Ward. Anika Ward is the founder of the Sankofa Leadership Network, which guides organizations, communities, and individuals through authentic systems shifts that center racial equity. For over 20 years, Anika has worked to improve outcomes for youth and families through partnerships that leverage the power of community voice, vision, and leadership. Most recently, she served as the Senior Director of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota Center for Prevention. Other previous roles have included work at the state of Minnesota to attract, support, and retain leaders of color in executive positions, and as the director of the Kitty Anderson Youth Science Center at the Science Museum of Minnesota, where she worked to build career pathways to increase engagement for women and people of color. A daughter of the historic Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, Anika's work and approach really reflect her value of community leadership and representation. She holds a master's degree in human services and a bachelor's in human resources management from Concordia University in St. Paul. In 2016, she was named one of the 40 under 40 by the Minneapolis St. Paul Business Journal. So we are so lucky that we have Anika to guide us through this series. We're in very good hands, and I always enjoy hearing from Anika. Thank you, and take it away, Anika.
Thanks so very much, Megan. I appreciate your words and super excited to be working with you on this. And we will all miss having Victoria engaged and involved in this way, but we are sure we'll see her in plenty of other ways in our equity work and equity spaces. So excited to do this. I just want to do a real quick review of last month, because we've spent time on why equity leadership matters. We talked about stepping into this work with an equity and excellence frame across our organizations, across the DEI work that we do. So centering excellence or centering equity within our conversations about excellence and the importance of that, knowing and recognizing that advancing DEI actually enables us to become more productive, more effective, more innovative, more fiscally healthy organizations. And so we also talked about Minnesota Nice and the importance of recognizing these disparate patterns in our organizations, actually in connection to the bigger picture, and recognizing that things are nice. Minnesota can be nice for some, and recognizing that nice for some effect within our organizations and taking it upon ourselves to address it, taking it upon ourselves to do the work to understand who it's nice for, who our businesses are nice for, are working for, who's getting the outcomes that they desire from our businesses, from our work, from our institutions, and who might not be, and making the shifts within the organization to make equitable outcomes possible. We heard from Keith Baker from Reconnect Rondo. We heard from Maureen Ramirez from DEED at the state of Minnesota. We talked about the history of government and institutional decisions that have resulted in greatly reduced economic opportunities, specifically impacting communities of color in particular. And we talked about how the elimination of St. Paul's Black community and economy has helped to create the incredible disparities that we see today. And so we can't separate this conversation from a lot of the organizational decisions and institutional decisions that are being made. And so that's why it's so important that we're in this work together. We're having this conversation together. We closed last month with a conversation and a charge, several charges. One is considering our vision. We heard about the Reconnect Rondo vision for change. We talked about language and definitions and the importance of being clear about what we mean when we say diversity, what we mean when we say equity, what we mean when we say inclusion, and defining all the words and terms that we're using to make sure that we've got alignment around that. And then we talked about this equity and excellence messaging and the responsibility that we have as leaders to embed the conversation about equity within the conversation about excellence. We talked about the fact that very often there are people, or we talked about the fact that it's our responsibility to start to think about that messaging. And then someone gave us, Maureen shared a tool that might help us plan DEI strategies, outcomes, and measurements. And so there was a challenge for many of us to check out that tool and spend time with it. So I hope you've had time to do that. Today's conversation is really centering a little bit more in our role, what our role looks like in equity leadership. What does it look like to leverage our position, the access we have, and the authority that we walk into spaces with, even regardless of what level organizational leadership or organizational role we play. We have positional power, we have access, we have authority that someone else doesn't have. And so we want to talk about what it looks like to leverage that to make a meaningful and sustainable difference. We want to be clear, so I'm going to share my screen. So we want to be clear that there's some work that we have to do as leaders as we step into this conversation. And within the Sankofa frame, Sankofa Leadership Network, we start these conversations with being really clear as an individual about what our vision is, about communicating the change that we expect to see, thinking about how we think, thinking about how we talk, and being very, very intentional about how we frame the truths, the narratives that we hear commonly within our organization. And we'll talk about that today. And then we start to move into setting the direction. We start to move into being clear about what the goals are. So we want to have these conversations about how we're framing the work, talking about the work, thinking about the work, and creating some alignment around that. Then we set the direction for where we're going. And then within the Sankofa frame, we have this equity roadmap that gets us talking. And we'll talk a lot in this space that we're in over the next few months around systems change and culture change. You'll hear a lot about those two things. In the Sankofa equity roadmap, we start with systems change and identifying the strategies that are needed in order to shift systems to produce more equitable outcomes. We move into culture change, recognizing that culture eats strategy for breakfast. You've heard that term, but recognizing that when we decide that our systems need to change and our processes and our policies need to change, there's some shifts in culture that we need to change as well, if we're going to get to the vision that we've set out. And so then we have to set the culture, our expectations and our clarity around the shifts in culture to align to that vision. And then we plug in support and accountability. So what are the ways that we support, develop, invest in people, create networks around us that support people and one another? And then what are the ways that we create accountability? So you'll hear us talk about a lot of this throughout the conversations we're in. And then once we move through that, we have to talk about what it looks like to structure ourselves to make that work real. So we've got to make sure that everything that we do, once we've set those things up, everything that we do provides a sense of alignment, creates or restructures, reorganizes, that we reorganize ourselves in a way that provides accountability, that provides systems, new systems, et cetera, for how people work together, and in a way that's sustainable. So oftentimes we have to shift roles. We have to think about how people can engage in this work in a way that's reasonable and sustainable. Often you'll hear people talk about who are working in equity work, talk about just some severe burnout that they see. And so we want to think about how we structure things in a way that allows us to be really successful. So in today's conversation, what I'd like to start off with a conversation about is this equity leadership stance. So within the Sankofa frame, is a continuum of equity leadership stances. We all show up, and what I want to make really clear is that we each show up every day, and we each show up very consistently within a stance. And people can, I'll share these stances with you in a second, but I really invite you to think about what stance you're in. So these are the stances that we use and that we talk about. Now, there are points on the stance before sympathizer, empathizer, but I'm not going to call those out, because if we're in this conversation today, I fully expect that we're on this map somewhere, right? So it starts with the sympathizer, empathizer. And we're really focused on, like, what is the what is the outcome that you're continually, consistently producing, making in this work. And for some, it's really starting with becoming sympathetic and then empathetic with issues that we previously haven't thought about. And so our action is listening, engaging, and showing up. We're investing time and we're investing attention, and that's important. But the main thing that's happening in that sympathizer, empathizer stance is that people know that we care. People know that we're interested. And that's, for many people, the place they start. And often in this space, we're cautious about speaking out because we don't want to hurt anyone. And we're worried that we might make a mistake that could harm someone. And so we might stay somewhat quiet, but we're listening and we're actively paying attention and showing up. People know that we care. The next step on the phase, or on the continuum, is ally and advocate. That's when we're learning to use our voice. We're leveraging our voice. We're leveraging the energy and the passion that we have for this work. And so we start to hear people really speak up, and we're practicing speaking up and being courageous in how we speak in ways that support people who face disparities. then that could be ourselves, right? That could be our own communities and other communities, but we're really learning how to talk the talk, the equity talk. In this space, often we start to do the kind of, we might have call out practices, right? And we're recognizing that I can call something out, I can call attention to something and make sure people are paying attention. Sometimes I might use shame to call attention to something because I don't know what else to do, but I know something is wrong and I'm going to point a finger at it and call attention and hopefully make sure someone changes. And so that's in the ally advocate space. We're learning and practicing using our voice. Often in the ally advocate stance, we haven't yet figured out where our power is to make significant long-term systemic change happen, right? So oftentimes in the ally advocate stance, people don't feel they have power. And so you'll hear people say, you know, I don't have power to do anything but use my voice, right? And that's kind of the space we're in when we're in the ally advocate frame. And then we move to the partner space, and that's where you hear people saying, oh, she really walks the walk, right? So-and-so really walks the walk, because they're leveraging resources they have, they're building a strategy with a focus on changing systems, changing the root causes of the issues. And that's when people really start getting to working side by side with folks, not speaking for or on behalf of, but starting to really recognize that we have investment in this issue. It matters not just to those people, not just to others, but it matters to us all. And so my future, my children's future is based on our ability to eliminate inequities for all of us and produce equitable outcomes. So these folks are really starting to feel confident and practicing walking the walk. And then we move into this champion stance. And at the champion stance, that's where we really see people stepping into this space where they're actually building, rebuilding systems, investing in other people, identifying people who might appear to be not to be equity leaders, but bringing in new allies, right? And having really difficult conversations with people who might, who others who are advancing equity might have a difficult time engaging with. But the champion is like building a sustainable systems for change. The champion knows that they can't be the only one. They can't be in the middle all the time. Sometimes they take the stage, but often they're sharing space with other people who aren't perfect. The champion recognizes that they aren't perfect and never will be, and that we're investing in imperfect people to make sure that we all have the opportunity to build systems, to restructure systems, to practice using our voice, walking the walk, talking the talk, etc. And so I see the champion as a person or as individuals who are really doing all the above, who are listening, engaging, who are talking the talk, using and leveraging their voice, their energy, who are partnering effectively and walking the walk, and who are building and investing in systems change and building connections with people to empower other people in this work. So if we think about this, each one of these stances is highly important. Each one of these stances makes a meaningful difference. At the sympathizer, empathizer stance, people feel heard, right? At the ally and advocate stance, people feel advocated for, which is really, really important. At the partnership stance, people feel change, right? And at the champion stance, people feel invested in and pulled in new and impactful ways. So I want you to think about how you show up in this space consistently and the impact you consistently make. And I want you to recognize that each of these stances and anywhere you fall on the spectrum is valid, is important, is valuable to the work. So where do you fall in here? And then I want to invite you to think about where you aspire to be. And when I say the conversation about growth, right? We really want, the champion is thinking about growth. The champion recognizes someone in sympathizer, empathizer stance and realizes it's just a matter of practice, right? So that person, if you're in sympathizer, empathizer, and you're frequently showing up but not sure how to communicate, how to engage, the action you can take is to begin practicing using your voice, right? And I caution people who might show up in the sympathizer empathizer stance about thinking about, well, I'm going to be a champion, I'm going to start investing in people. That's great, let's do that. But if you're going to really focus on trying to change really quickly, then what I encourage people to do is partner with or be mentored by, find someone who appears to be an equity champion, who is known as an equity champion. Find someone at the stage you aspire to be in and ask them to mentor you, ask them to support you, to provide real-time feedback. Because if you don't, there is risk, right? There's risk if we're really good practicing the sympathizer empathizer stance. When we talked a little bit earlier about the possibility of damage, about how much we care about investing in ways that don't cause damage, we need a partner to help us think about how we invest in people, how we build connections in a way that produces equitable outcomes. Because inadvertently, we see really good people with really strong intentions practicing, moving in a stance that they haven't had experience and practice in without someone who has, right? So really important to think about that. So I invite you to think about where you stand personally, where you aspire to stand, and how you'll get there. And then on the other hand, I invite you to think about, as you consider your organization, your team, and the types of behaviors you see on a regular basis on your team, where they stand in this stance. In general, if you could say, on average, the meetings that I have, we're really doing a lot of talking the talk, and that's great. Maybe we need to step into investing resources, investing in strategy to shift systems, right? So I invite you to think for yourself and to think for your organization. What we're going to do is give you a little bit of time in small groups to have some conversation and dialogue about this. Let's see. These are the questions. Where do you see yourself on the continuum today? Which stance do you aspire to show up in consistently? And then let's name, if you've got time in your space, in your groups, let's name one action we can take to strengthen our capacity to show up in that stance. One action that we can take to strengthen our capacity to show up in that stance. I'll pause for a second. I assume people have been thinking about where they show up. And I'll pause to see if there's any questions. I'll watch for the chat for a moment before you are put in groups, into your small groups. Welcome back. I think we've got everybody back in the room now here. All right, so thank you for going into space together and sharing with one another where you stand. It can be a little tricky to share and have these conversations, but I thank you, and I know you've had some thoughtful discussions. I'd love to hear themes. I'd love to have people share themes. Feel free to type in the chat or to come off mute. But first question is, what are the themes you're seeing? Where are people seeing themselves and or their organizations on this continuum?
Are you looking for comments?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So, I mean, we had a nice group of, I mean, I'm sure they're all nice, but I think we were pretty, like, kind of began at the beginning, and I think Al said that in our group that, you know, that kind of bridging that sort of taking what is in our personal lives and our interactions with our peers and more like friends and family, you know, outside of work, and translating that into the workplace environment. That's a big thing. It's a big thing for his environment. I work in a different environment than he does, but I kind of feel the same way too. I imagine a lot of people in this meeting do, and so that's kind of where we kind of noodled around topics around that sort of area, rather than getting big picture with what are we doing organization. Well, I guess we did touch on other big picture stuff too, but I don't know if that makes sense or not, but being authentic from your personal life and sort of being that authentic person in the work life as well is not always easy.
So you talked about kind of big barriers to shifting that, bringing that to the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's fair. We were just sort of acknowledging that that's not necessarily a super intuitive or easy thing to do all the time.
I think you're right. I think so. This conversation, this is about investment. This is about, and anytime we're making an investment, we're taking risk, right? And so when we think about investing in listening, that's why it's so hard. I think that's why it's so tough for people, because when we start off thinking about listening and engaging, there's a little less risk there showing up. And I think there's a lot of people who might show up personally as a champion or as a partner, and it takes a little bit more risk and a little bit more time to move through that continuum at work. So thanks for calling that out. Anything? Oh, I'm looking in the chat. Breakout saw majority of companies in sympathizer and empathizer area. And folks have a lot of growth opportunities. Thank you for that. I hear that a lot, and I think it's just really important to note. I value the sympathizer, empathizer space. I think it's really important that we're clear about the difference we're making, and about how we're showing up right now, and about our growth, what we expect from ourselves. And so no shame in any of these spaces that we show up, just really important to acknowledge. A lot of people, another note, lots of people in the sympathizer, empathizer space, and that's leading the company committees trying to find their role and sphere of influence at work. Another group talked about how we show up differently depending upon our own authority or power in a situation, and discussed that each person thinks that their company can and should be doing better. One of the things I want to encourage people to think about is that authority, role, and power, because we all have it. And so one of the things I try to get people, no matter what their level or role in the institution is, to think about and to be clear about is what their power is, because they have power. Where they know things that other people don't know. We have insight. We have access, we have the ability to influence people. And so in what ways are we going to take responsibility for leveraging that power? Any other thoughts, insights that came from your conversations?
I'll share. One of the things that we had talked about in our group was having, and maybe the word is the confidence, but and the agency to do the thing instead of waiting to make sure that you're doing the right thing and you're doing it the right way. On the journey that we're on, and it's evolving kind of like life, it's always changing. And so it's better to do something than to wait until you know that it's the right way and you're doing the right thing. It's better to do something than to do nothing.
Thank you for that, Bridget. So folks talk about courage. You've heard people talk about courageous leadership, courageous conversations. The thing that I think is really important about and Brene Brown talks about the call to courage. And I love the way she speaks about courage. The thing to recognize about courage is that it requires an investment and it requires some risk. And that the investment always produces something. And so even if we try something, we say something, and we realize we made a mistake, we've learned something, we've shared something. And I just want to call out the fact that it's sometimes hard for us to say something, to speak out, because we don't want to do damage. But what we start to realize is that our silence it can cause damage inadvertently. Our silence can help perpetuate status quo inequities, status quo behaviors in our organizations and systems. And so anything we do that offers a new way of looking at things, that offers a new perspective. Anything we share that offers a new perspective has an opportunity to shift status quo, even if we're wrong. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that is really powerful is when people, leaders and institutions make mistakes in front of people, and we all realize it's okay. We all actually learned something together. And that has power, one, because there's an opportunity for us to learn something and share something, and create alignment around, maybe that's not how we want to talk. Maybe we want to talk in this way. But two, culturally, because there's such a fear in our organizations of making a misstep that we're often frozen. So the first person who steps up and makes a misstep and other people see that it's okay. We're actually a learning institution. We're a learning group. We're offering these things from the perspective of individual and collective growth. The first person who does that, people tend to follow suit. A whole bunch of, it's like, but it takes that first person to step in and try something, and for people to go, oh, they didn't get their hand slapped. This is actually a culture where it's safe to learn. And what we want to do, that's one of the ways that we all, no matter what role we play in the organization, have power and influence, because we can step up. We can be the first one. So I just want to call that out. I know it's hard. It's difficult to move from that sympathizer, empathizer space to the other kind of investments that we're making. But it's really powerful. It's incredibly powerful. Other insights or themes that came out of your conversation? Oh, thank you for the comments in the chat about vulnerability. Yes, be vulnerable. And that is another Brene Brown, but there's so many stories about how folks, leaders introduce vulnerability. There's a story about, I think of someone who worked for Shell companies who, and there was an oil rig, and he brought someone to come into the company and support all these mostly men who had learned a way of engaging that did not allow vulnerability. And he brought someone in to really do some vulnerability work with folks, and people struggled and had a very difficult time and pushed back. But the really crazy thing is, over time, these folks learned how to have courageous conversations with one another, which led to 80% less deaths and accidents on the job pretty immediately, right? There's so many pieces of evidence about how vulnerability produces better outcomes for all people if we show up in a way that's vulnerable. And these workers were able to report back that they were able to trust. It's about trust. They were able to trust their colleagues, to hear them say when they felt unsafe, to hear them say when they had a concern, to hear them say, of course, when we translate that into our organizations, when the more of us that show up with vulnerability, the more we build trust within the organization for people who feel left out, for people who feel that there's opportunities to strengthen our diversity, equity, and inclusion focus within the organization, the more they'll feel able and confident that they can share those perspectives. And so it's kind of contagious, right? Courage is contagious. Go ahead. Okay, I thought I heard someone sharing. Watch the chat. I really appreciate those who are talking in the chat and sharing in the chat. And I invite you to continue to do so. Are there any last thoughts about this conversation before we move on to the next?
I think I have a comment, Anika. I think, in our group, many of us shared about organizations and where we thought they were. And definitely, I think my organization is at that early stage of the listener emphasizer. But I think we've had people there for long enough that we're really gently, and maybe not as gently, but we've been there long enough. And so in these next two stages, we're kind of combining those and sharing, here's the accountability that now we all must share and must do, and we all must, be, not only do the work, but be accountable for the measures. And so it's, I feel like a lot of organizations have been in that early stage, but it's almost like that sense of urgency. We can't stay there. What's the action? And helping people know what is expected in that action and moving toward that. And so I think that's the tension that holds, is that it's a comfortable place to be the listener and the sympathizer, but in order to have impact, we have to have action. And so I know for us, that's the place that we are not only inviting our leaders, but expecting them to be there. So, yeah.
Thank you for calling that out. I mean, so one of the things that I really struggle with leaders is the amount of shame, again, Brittany Brown, but the amount of shame that we have in these conversations when we know we're not doing anything, when we know we're not, and what I have found is the number one, if I can help people just like to swallow that lump in their throat, maybe like, and recognize that showing up is part of the work. That's a first step, right? You have steps beyond that we expect you to take and we require you to take, but showing up and showing you care is important. It's just that we have to layer other actions on top of that. We have to make sure we're accountable. And that's why, the spectrum we talk about, from empathy to accountability, right? Empathy, there's no real accountability for empathy. Having empathy and sympathy makes us feel warm, right? We know we're a good person when we're caring and we're paying attention and focusing. But there's not a ton of risk, right? We're not risking making mistakes because we're not doing anything. And at each layer, we're doing a little bit more, we're risking a little bit more. I think it's really important as organizational leaders and as colleagues to other people in these spaces to require that there's movement. And so if you're in that empathy, sympathy space, that's not bad, as long as you're moving, there's movement towards accountability. So I want to hold myself accountable for the outcomes that I want to see. That's as what it looks like as we're moving down that continuum, is that we're going from feelings, right, to as the thing that we're doing, to action, to change, to changing systems and producing more equitable outcomes. I think that's really, really important to know. Thank you for that, Colette.
Okay.
Okay, I want to move us to this next piece. So you've heard me talk about equity and excellence. And now we want to talk about narrative. So again, this is about, so as we think about the stance that we want to be in, most people say, well, I want to be in the champion stance. I think that's really important. I think we need partners, folks in the partner stance, and I think we need folks in the champion stance. And some folks will be in partner forever. And I'm not mad at that, because partner is focused on change. Partner is focused on shifting systems. It's focused on strategy. I think there will be some folks that will be in that space and some folks that will be in the champion space, and that's great. As we clarify where we want to move and how we want to show up and the impact we want to make in our organizations, in our communities, et cetera, it's really important to take a moment to think about the things we believe, the stories we accept. You'll hear these stories within the organizations that you work in. Often, it's about the stories that we tell ourselves, right? They really impact the way we show up in the world, the types of strategies that we implement, the investments we make. And so these stories are often widely acceptable or widely accepted, widely believed stories and truths in the organization. Often they're rooted in some type of truth. And they're often stories that shed light on reasons, explanations, and even excuses for what our barriers are, why we haven't accomplished what we want to accomplish. So in the equity conversation, there are usually reasons, explanations about why we're not as diverse as we expect to be, why we haven't retained diverse staff, why we're getting the types of outcomes. If you look at a healthcare organization, why are we producing inequitable health outcomes, right? Why are some people predictably doing better than other people, even though we feel like we're applying the same practices and support? But that goes across any organization, if you're a financial institution, et cetera. Often we hear people talk about culture-wise, what we're proud of about working for this organization. And what we're frustrated by. So you hear people say, like, I really love that people can be themselves at this organization, right? That's a story we tell. And it's just really important to evaluate those stories. Sometimes they seem benign, but they really help to guide and inform the way we show up in the workplace. So some examples of, as we consider equity and excellence narratives, when you hear someone talk about barriers to diversity, advancing diversity in our field and institution, what are the common things people say? What are the common things people say when they think about what makes someone a strong fit in our institution? I often hear people talk about, it's somebody I want to have a beer. Like if you're doing an interview process and there's a panel and there's two people who are coming out very close, the person who wins often is like, oh gosh, I want to have a beer with him. I would love to have a beer with him and just sit back and talk to him and pick his brain. Those are some of the narratives, right? So if that's the truth, then we're often looking for people that are very much like us, and fit means like us, as opposed to people hiring from a perspective that, like, I want to find someone who brings some pieces that we don't have, right? Like a puzzle piece that fits in the organization in a different way. Why is DEI important in our field and institution? Some people say because the leader says so, right? Our leaders really, really cares a lot about this. That's one of the narratives, like, okay, Sally cares so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I went to a really large institution years back, I remember someone saying, well, that's this leader's thing, right? So equity is this leader's thing. Each leader has their thing, and the next leader will have something else. So why is it important to our field and institution? What we want to hear people say in the organization is because we're committed to excellence. And this is how equity fuels excellence in our organization. So there's all these questions that we can ask ourselves where we'll hear the response back in a narrative form. The big thing that I want to kind of call out in this conversation is that each narrative serves a point, serves a purpose in the equity, diversity, and inclusion conversation. Each narrative is either serving to advance equity, it's serving to maintain the status quo, or it's specifically advancing inequities, which really has the same result as maintaining the status quo, right? Because we have inequitable outcomes that the status quo is consistently and predictably producing. And so the goal is, when we hear a narrative, a common one that comes up in every conversation is, in our organization, people say, it's really hard to find people of color, or it's really hard to find women who qualify for these roles, right? It's really hard to find qualified women. And I've heard this in every different space, right? Maybe, and I'm not worried about whether or not it's true. I'm worried about whether the way we're framing the narrative is challenging us or inspiring us to work harder, smarter, more innovatively, or if it's giving us permission and or excuses for conducting business as usual. And we know that business as usual is consistently producing inequitable outcomes. So if I hear something like, really hard to find qualified people of color for these types of roles, what I know is that when we say that, it inadvertently, unintentionally, often provides an excuse for us to just roll with the status quo, roll with the candidate pool that we've got. And I hear this, for example, at a point where someone says, well, I'm considering these 5 candidates, these are the top candidates, and someone in the group says, oh, not a lot of diversity there, right? And then the response is, well, you know, it's really hard to find qualified people of color. And then the group goes, oh, okay. Yeah, that's true, right? And so it gives us permission to stop trying, to stop working harder, to stop working. So what I'd like to see people do in terms of reframing that narrative is to come up with a statement. So as leaders, as individual contributors in our organization, we have an opportunity when someone says really hard to find qualified people of color, we have an opportunity to pause and say, yeah, and I think in our commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have a responsibility, and I think we're committed to being the best at identifying those people, identifying, recruiting, selecting, developing those that are out there, because they're there, right? If we were to ask somebody, does that mean that they're not there? Does that mean they're just, people would generally say, no, they're there. We just have all these reasons why somebody else has them, right? So if we're our best organization, if we're our best at recruiting great people, then we should be challenging ourselves to work harder, work smarter, work differently in a way that gets us the results that we want. So that means we're more attractive to those folks. So that's what we're looking for in this conversation, is a way to shift the narrative. I'm not saying you're wrong that it's hard to find people of color. I'm saying that that narrative is likely helping to maintain status quo or advancing inequities at your organization. And we have a opportunity and a responsibility to step in and shift the narrative. Any thoughts, pushback? I'm seeing in the chat, I love the conversations that are happening in the chat, so thank you. Any other perspective that anyone wants to add on that? What I just shared? Any pushback? I'll give you a minute to think about it. So that's what I want you to process. Think about a couple of narratives that exist within your organization. They're often those things when someone says, why aren't we more equitable? Why are we focused on advancing diversity and inclusion, etc.? Why aren't we more diverse? What's happening? And write down the answer to that question that you hear frequently within your organization. What is that? And then just consider whether it's advancing equity, whether it's challenging and inspiring us to be different and to show up differently in a way that's focused on producing different outcomes, or whether it allows us to maintain status quo, or whether it's like actively advancing inequities in the organization. And then begin to think about how we can reframe those narratives that are either maintaining status quo or advancing inequities. And then as we think about that, then what's our role? What's our opportunity as colleagues, as leaders, to step in and share kind of a reframe of those points? Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, I'm gonna give you work again to do then with one another. I'm gonna ask you to step into space together and process these questions. Here it is. Oops. Name one narrative that exists within your organization or field that has power to affect your DEI efforts. One narrative. And then what are the likely or potential impacts of that narrative? Is it advancing equity? Is it maintaining status quo? Or is it advancing inequities? And if it's either B or C, how might you reframe that narrative to have an equity positive effect? Make sense? Awesome. Okay. We're going to give you space to have those conversations in your group, those 3 questions. If you will each share one narrative, the likely impacts, and one way you might consider reframing that narrative. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want to open up a conversation and dialogue, and we'll meet you back here in a little bit to process aloud. Welcome back. Welcome back. Just waiting for everybody to come in and then we'll jump back in.
Awesome.
Welcome back. All right, I think we got everybody back in the room. Thanks for those conversations. I bounced around from room to room. And number one, there's so much industry diversity in this space. And it's exciting and powerful. So I, am excited to see that. Would love to hear some of the themes that are coming from your conversations. I heard a lot, and I'm excited to give the opportunity for you each to hear some of the themes that came out of your discussions. So I'll pause. What were some of the narratives that you heard? And how are people processing those narratives and what our roles might look like in shifting the narrative?
I can go first. This is Trevor Harwell. I'm from the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. Our group talked about the narratives, and I said one of our biggest challenges where I am is the narrative of why is this work important, or why are we diverting resources to it when it could be used on other things. And I talked about our DEI committee is actually working on what's called an equity response statement. It's kind of a canned response or a counter narrative to go off of what something Anika said. Just to kind of help people in those moments to kind of face that initial challenge, and to kind of give them a framework to work off to start what we call opportunities to educate, to kind of counter some of that negative energy, and reiterate why this work is important. Not only from a personal standpoint, but also from, especially for our office, we deal with the community a lot, illustrating why this work can be important, and how it just makes us better, both as an organization and then again how we serve our community. So,
Trevor, thanks for bringing that up, for bringing that into the bigger circle. I'm sure several people identify with hearing questions like that. And I love the idea of like proactively drafting the counter narratives and agreeing on your equity council or equity committee that you're responsible for making sure people, for promoting those counter narratives, and those messages about why it's important to your core work. Super important. Other themes that were coming up in your conversations, themes or something, or highlights, things you want to highlight?
I'll share if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Our group, I try not to talk, I'd rather listen to you, but our group was very interesting because we talked about the practicalities of change. One of my comments earlier was, what are some specific, you got to think about examples. You use terms like change, and you have to ask yourself, well, what does that actually mean to me and my world? What can I actually do? And we were talking to an industrial company that said, look, we need to build women's bathrooms. Right? It's about the idea that investing in a future that is diverse and that therefore that much more powerful requires us to invest in that future. And they can be as practical as ensuring you have a women's restroom. It can be as specific and organic as, my thinking is you've got to expand your own personal community and do so on purpose. And so intentionality, it simply requires that you invest in something. And one of in my mind, the resistance to embracing an inclusive future is that it requires additional effort. And I've spoken to my friends about this idea that if you're white you have the luxury of not doing anything because your world works. And frankly, we're busy. The challenge is your brothers and sisters who don't have that luxury require the need to lean in. Therefore, we must require it of ourselves to lean in, and it requires us to do things differently. How do we socialize? How do we talk about deals and business opportunities and sales and new networks? And how do you hire differently through not the traditional way we've always done things, but how do we think proactively and creatively within new networks? And that requirement of effort, I think, is a real challenge because in my mind, we're at that space of change that is requiring commitment through effort. And we will either lean in or we will resist. So I see there's this surf happening where you've got to do the work, you've got to operate differently, and it requires you to think differently and invest differently. And there's going to be a point where some folks are simply going to say, I don't want to work that hard. We need to be really intentional about and just acknowledge that human nature thing. And so that's a lot of what we talked about.
Thank you for that. The two questions that I heard you bring up was like, what can we actually do with the practicality of change, right? So I know that that's a big narrative in a lot of organizations, especially people who don't have institutional power. In one of the conversations I popped into on this breakout, there was someone who was saying, I'm an individual contributor, so I don't have a lot of authority, institutional authority, but I have a lot of influence, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to recognize and acknowledge, because you have that power. Influence is power, right? And so what do you do with it? How do you leverage it? And the other thing that you mentioned be this narrative. Well, I pulled this out of what you were saying, was like the way we've always done things. We hear that a lot in organizations, like we've always partnered with these people and they're great partners, right? These are the people we've always done it with. And this is the way we've always done it. And there's a reason we do it that way, right? And so I think that narrative that there's some really good, there's also this narrative I've heard in some organizations that are client-based, that they are committed to providing excellent service and they have a formula that allows them to create great service and to knock it out the ballpark every time. And so when then we try to embed equity best practices into that, it's really difficult for them to be different if they're so focused on being perfect, what their definition of perfect is, and they don't have space. Then we're trying to get people to recognize, then you're not innovative. You don't have space to innovate if you're so focused on getting it right every time, being perfect every time. You're being perfect for someone. And let's recognize that you've got a structure that is allowing you to provide really great outcomes for someone, and we need to shift that. So these narratives are really, really important. What are some other, were there any other ones you want to share, Sarah?
Yeah, our group talked a little bit about how to bridge the gap. So how to provide or create opportunities to meet people where they're at, recognizing that maybe this job might require skill set A, but skill set B could also work for the same job. So maybe thinking outside the box and really looking at the skills that people have rather than what degrees they have to create those opportunities. And then, also a focus on mental health, because that's so important for allowing people to really be their authentic self at work. If you're not in a good place mentally, you're not performing as well, you're getting passed over for opportunities. So how can we provide those mental health resources and make that a priority to allow everybody to have an opportunity for advancement?
Thank you so much for that. The way we've always hired, I see that in alignment to kind of the way we've always done things. One role that I had, I found out, and we were noticing all these barriers to people, diverse people getting hired. And one of them was, we've got these job descriptions that require experience that basically means you would have had to have worked for this organization, this institution before. That is very not diverse. And so really we're saying we want this, we want to pick from the same pool. And then when I started to have this conversation with leaders, it was the reason that they were using those was because somebody else like 10 years ago, before they were even hired, used that position description. There wasn't any real reason beyond that. We just weren't rethinking. We weren't expecting ourselves to improve job descriptions on a regular basis and make sure the job descriptions are actually getting us the types of candidates we're looking for, the types of candidates we so desperately want to bring in. Any other thoughts on this or themes that you would be willing to share with your colleagues in this space? And please do keep them coming in the chat as well if there's something that you want to share but you don't want to come off mute.
Hi, Anika. This is Wanda Kirkpatrick. And I wanted to say that one thing we really need to remember is that we can have great fun doing this work. There's no doubt about it. It can be so rewarding, but it is also very hard. And if you're going to come into the work thinking, people are going to rally around me, we're going to change the world, we're going to, I don't even need to change the world, I need to change what I'm doing right now in the space that I have. That is not going to be easy. And we have to realize that it's going to take time. It's going to take a great deal of strength and an opportunity for us to get into the work is going to be a long-term investment. And if you think that it's just going to be, we're going to do it, I know it, and it's the right thing to do, that's great, because sometimes you have people working around you that say the same thing, but sometimes you have people around you who don't say that. So I want to encourage everybody to do the work. It is so rewarding and you can have so much fun with it, but don't come into it thinking that it's going to be something that is going to, everyone is going to jump on and say, let's get this done. So I just wanted to get that out there and hear your thoughts on how that works for you and for people that you've seen in the past.
Wanda, thank you for bringing that up. Doreen McKesson, I love Brene Brown, but Doreen McKesson and Brene Brown have this, there's one podcast that they did together a few years ago where he was saying something about like, where is the joy in this work? Like we work so hard and we're so committed to change and we recognize that there's really dire things happening. And we have to balance that, like frustration. We should never be satisfied because there's always work to do. We have to balance that with some level of understanding that there's joy in this work. And so, you know, a couple of things. I'm working with Dr. Brittany Lewis, who is a fantastic researcher, and we've interviewed 50 leaders of color around the country. And we've been asking them, you know, these really hard questions, and they've been sharing things with us like, when you're really doing this work and you're really investing and you're really taking risks for a purpose, people will be mad at you, who you think should be on your side, who you think should be supportive of what you're doing, but you're changing things. And so some people feel a lot safer with the problems they have than some other reality, right? And so there's all these things that get in our way when we're trying to make change happen. Even sometimes people and energy from groups that we think we're trying to support. And we have to know that we're doing the right thing and that we're choosing really strategic action. And we also have to know that there's going to be difficult moments. Some people are going to really want change, but disagree with our strategy. Some people are really going to struggle with the idea of change because you're asking that you're moving their cheese. And so there's all these different, barriers that come up. And I think it really is important to know that even if it hurts, like sometimes it hurts. The thing that I love about DeRay McKesson and Brene Brown is that even when it hurts, we should be shifting it back to joy. We should be shifting finding ways to structure our work in a way that fulfills and energizes us. Because absolutely, we're going to be working really hard. Absolutely, we're going to have barriers that sometimes come from spaces that surprise us. And so we have to do the work to energize ourselves and make sure we can show up in a way that's sustainable, that sustains our energy, that brings new people in. I think that's the biggest thing. And then the other thing, Wanda, that comes to mind with what you just mentioned is creating a culture of learning within the organization where we do have space to make mistakes, but we support the learning and we're invested in the learning as the outcome, not perfection, right? Because the more people are comfortable trying things and being innovative, the more ideas that we'll have. And the more when we don't get it perfectly, people will support each other and appreciate the effort to disrupt status quo. A couple of things, I'm going to hand it back to Megan in a second, but a couple of things that I just want to call out. There was this conversation about the equity response statement. I think I want to bring us back to briefly, because that narrative, the narrative that I'm assuming is probably happening in Trevor's organization, is a narrative I've heard in so many places. When I worked for the state years ago, and I had the opportunity to do an interview with the newspaper, and we were so excited about all these diverse leaders who were coming and helping to change the way we worked. And then the comments under the article, there were people saying, oh, there they go. They've invested in diversity at the expense of standards. So they just brought people in, right? It's one or the other, right? As diversity goes up, our standards are lowered somehow. And so it's really our responsibility to make sure that we're messaging equity and excellence. Actually, what we're trying to do is be our best and work our hardest and our smartest, and to continually, what I'm hearing and what Trevor's team has done is making sure you're proactively creating a response to those narratives that would take the wind out of your work and out of your efforts. Thank you all for being and sharing this space with us. A couple things that I just want to point out in terms of the status quo conversations. There's a community-led, and you can Google this, and we probably can send out the links to this as well. But there's an article from the Brookings Institute in 2020 that's called No More Status Quo. And it's a community-led action plan for addressing structural inequity, specifically during COVID-19. And it's a great article as you're thinking about disrupting status quo. And then there's one from Nature Genetics 2020 that's called Racism and the Status Quo. And they're talking about their responsibility and the impact their field has made on creating disparities, systemic disparities, recognizing that and recognizing their institution's responsibility for shifting. Those are really good articles as you think about your own equity leadership stance and the way you want to show up and what you want to ground yourself in as you disrupt status quo. We will see you again in May for a conversation about our role in systems change. Again, I want to thank you for all that you've shared. I encourage you all to go through the chat because people have shared so much more there. And I will turn it over to Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anika. This has been, I think, a really thought-provoking, wonderful workshop. So thank you for guiding us through that. Just being able to sit and reflect on these things, it's so powerful. So I would encourage all of you, if there's a word from today or a note you want to keep in front of you to remind you of this conversation and this work, write that down. Write it down, stick it next to your desk or your computer so you see it every day. It's really up to all of us to keep pushing this work forward. So thank you once again to our sponsors. We so appreciate your commitment to this work. And as I said earlier, we encourage you all to stay connected. So both to us, we'll put up a slide about how you can stay connected with the chamber and to each other. If there was somebody that you clicked with in your groups today, jot their name down, invite them for coffee, follow up, keep thinking about how you can help support each other and brainstorm and work together in this work. So I want to end with a couple of invitations. So stick with me for a minute here. First, I do want to mention one more time our DEI collaborative here at SPAC, which some of you have heard about before. And this group still has space for a few more C-suite level executives to join the next cohort, which begins May 10th. So whether that might be you or someone you know that you want to recommend this to, much like the learning that took place today, the cohort, which is also facilitated by Anika, supports executive leaders in taking a deeper dive to explore their personal identities and their cultural lenses. So they're able to share successes and challenges of transforming their workplaces to be more equitable and inclusive and impacting the experiences of their employees. So the collaborative sessions there are for peer leaders to really identify the best practices for closing opportunity gaps and for employees and communities across the region. It's in kind of a confidential setting where they can really work together. So you can learn more about that schedule. We'll put the link in the chat here. And if you're interested or you want somebody to reach out to, just email Kathleen Lomar-Exel, who's here at our chamber, and I put the email in the chat too. So next, we know that this series is virtual, but we also want to provide a space if you would like to get to know each other and connect with some of your colleagues here. So if you're interested, we invite you to come out to our first Chamber Connect event. It's going to be a networking event we do for the next 6 months. If you can't make this one, maybe make the next one. But if you all are interested, I wanted to extend a specific invitation to you to come next Wednesday. From 4 to 6, we'll be at Memento Restaurant in downtown St. Paul. It's the former Pazza Luna, but it's brand new now. It's got a beautiful mural, and we will be there. So if you want, you can look at that. We'll put our events calendar link in the chat, and there are also a few other upcoming events that you'll see on the screen here. We have a Twins event going on if you're a baseball fan and you want to come network with folks. Or our golf classic in the summer is also a great way to meet more people. So as Anika said, the next session in our series will be on May 18th, kind of before we break for the summer and come back again. And that will focus on changing systems that create inequity in our workplaces. We're going to have a really wonderful lineup of speakers, so please mark your calendar for that. And we will also add the link shortly, and we'll send it out later for the survey for today. Please do take a moment and give us your feedback so that we can continue to make these really useful sessions. So thank you all for making time to be here today. Have a wonderful day. That's it.